What began in 1845 as one of Britain's most confident naval ventures dissolved into one of history's longest-running mysteries, only to be gradually reconstructed more than a century later through graves, cairns, Inuit knowledge, and finally the rediscovery of the two ships themselves. Into the White Void. Two ships disappeared into the Arctic and never returned. 129 men vanished with them. No distress signal, no survivors, no confirmed eyewitnesses. For years, families waited for letters that never arrived. Governments launched search missions across one of the harshest environments on Earth. Newspapers printed theories. Sailors exchanged rumors in distant ports. Explorers risked their own lives searching for clues. Yet the Arctic remained silent. The mystery became so famous that it would haunt the British Empire for generations. What happened to the men of the Franklin expedition? Why did two of the most technologically advanced ships of their age disappear? And how could an expedition backed by one of the world's greatest naval powers be swallowed by ice? To answer those questions, the story must begin long before the ships vanished. It begins with an obsession. An obsession with finding a route through the Arctic. In the 19th century, global trade was transforming the world. The British Empire stretched across continents, ships connected distant territories, goods flowed between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Yet one major challenge remained. Travel between Europe and Asia required long and expensive voyages around Africa or across dangerous seas. For centuries, explorers dreamed of finding a shortcut. This dream became known as the Northwest Passage. The concept appeared simple on maps. If a navigable route could be found through the maze of Arctic islands north of Canada, ships could travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans much faster. In reality, the Arctic was one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Massive ice fields blocked channels. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Storms appeared without warning. Navigation was difficult. And rescue was almost impossible. Many expeditions attempted the passage. Most failed. Some never returned. Yet each failure only increased the determination of explorers and governments. By the 1840s, Britain believed it possessed the technology, experience, and naval expertise needed to finally solve the puzzle. The Royal Navy had become one of the most powerful maritime forces in history. Its officers had mapped coastlines across the globe. Its ships crossed oceans with confidence. And among its ranks stood a veteran explorer who seemed perfectly suited for the challenge. His name was Sir John Franklin. Franklin was already a respected figure. Born in 1786, he entered naval service at a young age. His career carried him around the world. He fought during the Napoleonic Wars. He participated in scientific voyages. He endured difficult overland expeditions in northern Canada. These experiences earned him a reputation for perseverance. Not every expedition had gone smoothly. During one earlier Arctic journey, starvation became so severe that members of the expedition resorted to desperate measures simply to survive. Yet Franklin survived. His determination impressed both colleagues and government officials. By the mid-1840s, he was viewed as a suitable leader for Britain's greatest Arctic challenge. At 59 years old, he accepted command of what many hoped would be the expedition that finally completed the Northwest Passage. The mission would become one of the most ambitious voyages in Arctic history. Preparations were extensive. The Royal Navy selected two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Both vessels already possessed remarkable histories. Years earlier, they had participated in Antarctic exploration under the command of James Clark Ross. The ships had proven capable of operating in extreme polar conditions. For the new mission, they underwent significant modifications. Their hulls were reinforced. Steam engines were installed. Iron plating strengthened vulnerable areas. Special heating systems improved living conditions. Huge quantities of food were loaded on board. The expedition carried supplies intended to last several years. At the time, these ships represented some of the most advanced polar vessels ever assembled. Many believed success was almost guaranteed. Few imagined they were preparing for disaster. The crew consisted of 129 officers and sailors. They came from different backgrounds. Some were experienced naval veterans. Others were younger men seeking adventure and opportunity. Many left families behind. Wives, parents, children, and friends gathered to say farewell. For some, it would be the last time they ever saw their loved ones. The atmosphere surrounding the expedition was optimistic. Britain expected triumph. Scientific discoveries would likely follow. Maps would be improved. The Northwest Passage might finally be conquered. And Sir John Franklin would return as a national hero. That was the expectation. History had other plans. On May 19, 1845, the expedition departed England. Crowds watched the ships leave. Flags waved. Voices cheered. The vessels sailed westward across the Atlantic. The first stage of the voyage appeared successful. The ship stopped in Greenland. Additional supplies were obtained. Letters were sent home. Crew members described high morale. Everything seemed normal. Those letters would become some of the last direct communications ever received from the expedition. During the summer of 1845, the expedition entered increasingly remote waters. The Arctic environment grew harsher. Icebergs drifted through cold seas. Fog frequently reduced visibility. Yet the voyage continued. The final confirmed European sighting occurred in late July 1845. Whaling ships encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay. The crews exchanged greetings. Nothing appeared unusual. The Franklin expedition seemed healthy and confident. The ships then continued westward. They disappeared into the Arctic. No European would ever see them again. At first, nobody worried. Arctic expeditions often remained away for years. Silence was expected. The ships carried substantial provisions. The crews were experienced. And Britain assumed progress was being made. Months passed. Then years. Still no news arrived. Concern gradually increased. Families became anxious. Officials began asking questions. Where was Franklin? Why had no messages appeared? Had the expedition become trapped in ice? Or had something far worse occurred? Nobody knew. The Arctic offered no answers. Only endless ice. By 1847, concern had become alarm. The absence of communication was becoming difficult to explain. Pressure mounted on the British government. Public interest intensified. Newspapers followed developments closely. Relatives of the missing men demanded action. Among the most determined advocates was Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin. She refused to accept uncertainty. She campaigned relentlessly for search efforts. Her determination would play a major role in launching one of the largest rescue operations in exploration history. The search for Franklin soon became a massive international effort. Dozens of expeditions would eventually enter the Arctic. Ships searched frozen channels. Sledging parties crossed dangerous ice fields. Explorers investigated remote coastlines. Years passed. Then decades. Each expedition hoped to discover survivors. Instead, they found fragments. A report here. A rumor there. An abandoned campsite. A piece of equipment. A grave. The mystery deepened. Every clue seemed to raise new questions. What nobody yet understood was that tragedy had already unfolded. Far beyond the reach of rescue. Far beyond the reach of communication. In a frozen wilderness where temperatures could kill within hours. The men of Erebus and Terror were facing conditions unlike anything most Europeans had ever experienced. And somewhere within that immense landscape, the fate of 129 men was being written into history. A story of ambition. A story of endurance. A story of mystery. And a story that would remain unsolved for more than a century. The Arctic was keeping its secrets. For now, the first clues from the ice. The Arctic remained silent. Years passed without a single confirmed message from the Franklin expedition. Across Britain, hope slowly gave way to uncertainty. Uncertainty gradually became fear. By the late 1840s, newspapers regularly asked the same question. Where was Sir John Franklin? No one could answer. The two ships that had sailed confidently into the Arctic in 1845 had seemingly vanished from the world. The disappearance was becoming one of the greatest mysteries of the 19th century. Families waited for news. Children grew older without hearing from fathers. Wives reread old letters. Parents clung to fading hope. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the northern horizon, the Arctic continued to guard its secrets. Yet the search was already beginning. And the first clues would emerge from a landscape of ice, rock, and silence. The British government could not ignore the situation indefinitely. Public pressure increased every year. Members of Parliament asked questions. Newspapers criticized the lack of action. The Royal Navy understood that the disappearance of two naval vessels and 129 men was not merely a private tragedy. It had become a national concern. By 1848, official search operations were underway. Several expeditions were dispatched to different regions of the Arctic. Some entered through Baffin Bay. Others approached from the Pacific side. Still others explored areas where Franklin might have attempted to push westward. The search was unlike anything previously attempted. Large portions of the Arctic remained poorly mapped. Navigation was difficult. Weather conditions were extreme. Searchers often found themselves facing the same dangers that had likely threatened Franklin himself. Ice-trapped ships. Storms damaged equipment. Men suffered frostbite. Supplies ran low. Yet they continued. Because somewhere ahead might be survivors. At first, search teams expected to find Franklin alive. This may seem surprising today, but Arctic voyages often lasted several years. Ships sometimes remained trapped in ice through multiple winters. Experienced explorers understood that long periods without communication were possible. Therefore, early search efforts focused primarily on rescue. The goal was simple: find the expedition, deliver supplies, bring the men home. But as time passed, optimism began to fade. Every empty bay increased concern. Every unexplored channel raised new fears. Every season without news made survival seem less likely. Among the most determined figures in this entire story was Lady Jane Franklin. Her husband had vanished into the Arctic. Yet she refused to surrender hope. Again and again, she lobbied government officials. Again and again, she raised public awareness. Again and again, she encouraged new searches. Few individuals contributed more to the effort to discover Franklin's fate. Without her persistence, some later expeditions might never have occurred. Her campaign transformed the search into a national mission. The mystery would not be forgotten. As search ships entered Arctic waters, another source of information became increasingly important. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic. For thousands of years, Inuit communities had survived in regions where European explorers struggled to remain alive. They understood local geography. They understood ice conditions. They understood animal migrations. Most importantly, they often observed events that outsiders never witnessed. At first, many European explorers underestimated the value of Inuit knowledge. This would prove to be a serious mistake. Over time, searchers learned that local observations could provide vital clues. And some of the earliest clues about Franklin's fate would come from Inuit testimony. During the early years of the search, reports began to circulate. Some Inuit described encounters with groups of white men. Others reported seeing large ships trapped in ice. Still others spoke of starving strangers moving southward. Initially, many of these stories were treated cautiously. Searchers struggled to determine which accounts were accurate. Details varied. Locations differed. Dates were uncertain. Yet one pattern gradually emerged. Something had gone terribly wrong. One of the most significant search expeditions was led by James Clark Ross. Ross knew the Arctic well. He had previously commanded successful polar voyages. In 1848, he entered Arctic waters hopping to locate Franklin. The conditions he encountered were brutal. Ice blocked movement. Winter darkness complicated operations. Despite tremendous effort, Ross failed to locate the missing expedition. However, his voyage demonstrated how difficult the search would become. Finding Franklin was not simply a matter of sailing north. The Arctic covered an immense area. Countless channels, islands, and frozen coastlines stretched across the region. A lost expedition could remain hidden for years. As the searches continued, another reality became increasingly apparent. The Arctic was preserving evidence. Cold temperatures slowed decay. Objects abandoned decades earlier might remain recognizable. Campsites could survive. Equipment could survive. Even human remains might survive. This raised a troubling possibility. If Franklin's men had perished, traces of their journey might still exist. The challenge was finding them. The breakthrough came gradually rather than dramatically. No single discovery solved the mystery. Instead, fragments emerged piece by piece. Each clue added another section to a growing puzzle. One search party discovered signs of human activity. Another recovered abandoned equipment. Elsewhere, Inuit accounts described unusual encounters. Individually, the clues seemed incomplete. Together, they suggested a tragedy unfolding somewhere deep within the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The first truly shocking discovery occurred on a remote island. In 1850, searchers reached a place known as Beechy Island. Located in the high Arctic, the island appeared bleak and lifeless. Rock, ice, snow, silence. Yet hidden within this desolate landscape lay the first confirmed evidence of Franklin's expedition. Searchers found graves. 3 graves. Carefully constructed. Clearly marked. Undeniably British. The men buried there were identified as John Torrington, William Brain, John Hartnell. For the first time since 1845, physical proof of the expedition had been found. The discovery electrified Britain. At last, Franklin's route was becoming clearer. The expedition had successfully reached Beechy Island during its first winter. But the graves raised disturbing questions. Why had 3 men died so early? The ships had carried extensive provisions. The crews had departed in good health. Yet within months, 3 sailors were dead. Nobody knew why. Additional evidence revealed that the expedition had spent the winter of 1845–1846 at Beechy Island. Remains of campsites were discovered. Food tins were found. Other artifacts confirmed the location. This information provided an important timeline. Franklin's men had survived their first Arctic winter. At least initially, the expedition appeared organized and functional. There was no obvious sign of catastrophe. The real disaster lay ahead. The discovery of the graves transformed the search. For years, explorers had been searching almost blindly. Now they possessed a confirmed starting point. Attention shifted farther south and west. If Franklin had left Beechy Island in 1846, where had he gone next? What route had he chosen? And why had no one returned? These questions drove the next phase of exploration. Throughout the 1850s, search missions expanded. British expeditions entered previously unexplored regions. American vessels joined the effort. Private funding supplemented government support. The scale of the search became extraordinary. Ironically, the quest to find Franklin contributed significantly to Arctic mapping. Large areas previously unknown to Europeans were surveyed. Coastlines were charted. Channels were identified. Geographic knowledge increased dramatically. Even in failure, the search advanced exploration. Then came another major breakthrough. An explorer named John Ray obtained information from Inuit communities that would change everything. Ray was an experienced traveler. Unlike many European explorers, he respected indigenous survival knowledge. He learned from local techniques. He adapted to Arctic realities. As a result, he often traveled more effectively than many of his contemporaries. In 1854, Inuit witnesses provided Ray with disturbing accounts. According to these reports, groups of white men had been seen traveling southward. They appeared exhausted. They appeared hungry. Some were dragging boats and equipment across the ice. Later, bodies were reportedly found. The descriptions suggested that Franklin's men had abandoned their ships. This revelation shocked the public. The expedition had not simply vanished aboard intact vessels. Something had forced the crews onto the ice. Something catastrophic. The reports became even more controversial. Some Inuit accounts suggested evidence of cannibalism among the final survivors. Victorian Britain reacted with disbelief. Many people refused to accept the possibility. Franklin's men were Royal Navy sailors. They were viewed as disciplined, honorable, and civilized. The idea that starvation might have driven them to such extremes seemed unimaginable. Debates erupted. Arguments filled newspapers. Some rejected the reports entirely. Others feared they might be true. At the time, there was no definitive proof. The mystery deepened once again. What was becoming clear, however, was that Franklin's expedition had not ended quickly. This was not a single storm. Not a sudden shipwreck. Not one dramatic moment. Instead, evidence pointed toward a prolonged struggle. Months. Perhaps years. Men trapped far from rescue. Men fighting cold, hunger, disease, and isolation. Men attempting to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Still, crucial questions remained unanswered. Where were the ships? What happened to Franklin himself? How many men survived after abandoning the vessels? What route did they follow? And why had one of the most advanced expeditions of its era failed so completely? The answers remained hidden somewhere within the Arctic. Frozen beneath snow and ice. Waiting. The graves on Beechy Island were only the beginning. The true story of the Franklin expedition was far darker than anyone yet imagined. And future discoveries would reveal a disaster that unfolded over years, not days. A disaster written across the frozen landscape of the far north. One clue at a time, the message in the care. For nearly a decade after the Franklin expedition disappeared, the Arctic yielded only fragments. 3 graves on Beechy Island. Abandoned campsites. Scattered artifacts. Reports from Inuit witnesses. Nothing provided a complete explanation. The fate of 129 men remained one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the world. Then, in 1859, searchers discovered a document. A single sheet of paper. Only a few hundred words long. Yet those words would become the most important evidence ever recovered from the Franklin expedition. For the first time, the missing sailors themselves spoke from beyond the Arctic silence. And what they revealed changed everything. The discovery was made by an expedition led by Francis Leopold McClintock. McClintock had been sent to the Arctic largely through the efforts of Lady Jane Franklin. More than a decade had passed since her husband's disappearance. Most people believed the expedition was lost. But Jane Franklin continued searching. She wanted answers. Not rumors. Not theories. Answers. Her determination funded one final major search voyage. That decision would prove historic. McClintock sailed aboard a small vessel named the Fox. The journey was difficult from the beginning. The Arctic showed little mercy. Heavy ice repeatedly blocked progress. At one point, the ship remained trapped for months. Many expeditions would have abandoned the mission. McClintock refused. He pressed onward. His goal was simple. Find evidence. Any evidence. By 1859, his search parties were exploring areas around King William Island. This remote island occupied a central place in Inuit accounts. Several earlier reports suggested Franklin's men had been seen nearby. If answers existed, they might be found there. The landscape seemed almost lifeless. Rocky shores stretched toward the horizon. Snow drifted across frozen ground. The wind howled endlessly. Even during summer, conditions remained harsh. Yet beneath this desolate surface lay one of history's greatest discoveries. During one sledging expedition, a member of McClintock's party noticed something unusual. A stone cairn. Cairns were common markers in Arctic exploration. Explorers often left messages inside them. The structure appeared ordinary. But when investigators examined it closely, they found a metal cylinder. Inside the cylinder was a document. The paper had survived years of Arctic weather. It contained a message written by members of Franklin's expedition. The mystery was finally beginning to speak. At first glance, the document appeared encouraging. The original note had been written on May 28, 1847. It reported that the expedition had wintered successfully at Beechy Island. It stated that the ships had sailed southward afterward. Most importantly, it indicated that everything seemed normal. The officers signing the message reported no major disaster. At that moment, the expedition still appeared viable. If searchers had found only that version, the mystery might have remained unsolved. But something remarkable had happened. The document had later been updated. Written around the margins was a second message. And that second message revealed catastrophe. The update was dated April 25, 1848. Nearly a year after the original note. The difference in tone was shocking. The ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had become trapped in ice. They had remained imprisoned since September 1846. For more than a year and a half, they had failed to escape. The situation had deteriorated dramatically. Even more devastating was another revelation. Sir John Franklin was dead. The message stated that Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. Britain's famous explorer had perished in the Arctic. The expedition had lost its commander. The document also contained numbers that stunned investigators. By April 1848, 24 officers and crew members were already dead. 24. Nearly one-fifth of the entire expedition. Something terrible was happening. Yet the greatest shock came next. The surviving men had decided to abandon the ships. 105 survivors planned to leave Erebus in Terror. They would travel south toward the mainland. The message identified the leaders of this desperate effort. Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames. The note ended. No further written messages have ever been found. The document raised as many questions as it answered. Why had the ships become trapped? Why had so many men died? Why abandon vessels that contained supplies and shelter? Most importantly, what happened after the survivors left? The Arctic still refused to provide complete answers. But the message transformed understanding of the disaster. Searchers now possessed a timeline. The expedition had not vanished immediately. Instead, the tragedy unfolded gradually. The ships survived their first winter. Then became trapped. Then Franklin died. Then more men died. Finally, the survivors abandoned the vessels. The disaster had evolved step by step. The location of the trapped ships also revealed an important truth. Franklin had actually succeeded in exploring significant portions of the Northwest Passage. In a geographical sense, the expedition had achieved part of its objective. The problem was survival. The route led directly into one of the most dangerous ice regions in the Arctic. Once trapped, escape became extraordinarily difficult. Modern observers sometimes underestimate Arctic sea ice. It is not merely frozen water floating harmlessly on the surface. In many places, ice pressure becomes immense. Sheets of ice collide. Massive ridges form. Channels close unexpectedly. Ships can become imprisoned for years. Even powerful modern vessels respect Arctic ice. For wooden ships in the 1840s, the challenge was enormous. As McClintock continued searching, additional evidence emerged. Artifacts appeared along the coastline. Silverware, tools, buttons, pieces of equipment. Some objects seemed practical. Others seemed strangely unnecessary. Investigators were puzzled. Why had starving men carried heavy silver plates? Why transport items that added weight but offered little survival value? The discoveries suggested that the expedition's survivors may not have fully adapted to their situation. Naval traditions and assumptions sometimes persisted even as conditions worsened. One of the most famous discoveries occurred near the western coast of King William Island. Searchers encountered a boat mounted on a heavy sled. The sight was extraordinary. The vessel had been dragged across the Arctic landscape. Inside were numerous objects. Weapons, clothing, cooking equipment, books, personal belongings. The collection offered a haunting glimpse into the final struggle. At some point, exhausted sailors had attempted to transport the boat over land. Why? Most likely because they hoped to reach open water. Perhaps they imagined eventually sailing south. Perhaps they intended to use the boat once ice conditions improved. Whatever their plan, it failed. The boat remained where it was abandoned. A silent witness to desperation. McClintock's expedition also collected more Inuit testimony. Many accounts shared similar themes. White men traveling south. Men growing weaker. Men dying along the journey. Some reports described a large group. Others described smaller parties. Together, they suggested a slow collapse. Not everyone died at once. The expedition fragmented. Survivors continued moving. Some likely perished earlier than others. The final months were probably chaotic. One detail emerged repeatedly. The men appeared physically weakened. This observation would later become extremely important. Researchers eventually proposed several possible causes. Starvation was obvious. But starvation alone might not explain everything. Disease was another possibility. Exposure to severe cold could also contribute. And there was another factor that would attract increasing attention in later decades. Lead poisoning. The expedition carried thousands of canned food containers. Some researchers suspected that lead from food preservation methods might have affected crew health. The theory would remain controversial for years. But it raised important questions about the hidden dangers facing Franklin's men. The discovery of the cairn message fundamentally changed the investigation. Before 1859, the mystery consisted largely of speculation. After 1859, historians possessed direct evidence. The expedition had survived until at least April 1848. Franklin had died. The ships had been abandoned. 105 survivors attempted to escape on foot. Beyond that point, however, the trail vanished once again. The final chapter remained unwritten. As news reached Britain, public reaction was intense. The mystery that had captivated the nation for more than a decade now appeared even more tragic. Franklin was dead. His men had endured years trapped in ice. Dozens had already perished before abandoning the ships. Yet the ultimate fate of the remaining survivors remained unknown. Families finally received some answers. But not enough. Never enough. Where exactly had the men gone? How long had they survived? Did any reach the Canadian mainland? Did anyone live beyond 1848? No one knew. For historians, the cairn message became the central document of the Franklin story. Every word was analyzed. Every date was examined. Every detail mattered. The paper represented a voice from the lost expedition itself. A message carried across time. A brief communication from men standing on the edge of catastrophe. Men who could not know that future generations would study their words. Men who could not know that the mystery surrounding their fate would endure for centuries. Yet despite the importance of the document, one enormous question remained unanswered. Where were the ships? HMS Erebus. HMS Terror. The vessels had disappeared after being abandoned. No search expedition found them. Decades passed. Then generations. The ships became legends. Some believed they had been crushed by ice. Others believed they had sunk quickly. Still others suspected they might remain preserved somewhere beneath Arctic waters. No one knew. And for more than 150 years, the Arctic refused to reveal the answer. The ships that launched one of history's greatest exploration mysteries remained hidden. Waiting beneath ice, darkness, and cold. Waiting for the 21st century, the death march across the ice. The cairn message had revealed the turning point. Sir John Franklin was dead. The ships were frozen beyond rescue. And 105 surviving men made one final decision. They would abandon the safety of their vessels and attempt to walk out of the Arctic. It was a decision made in desperation. And it would lead to one of the most tragic survival journeys in exploration history. By April 1848, the situation aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had become unbearable. For nearly 2 years, the ships had been trapped in sea ice near King William Island. The ice did not simply surround them, it imprisoned them. Pressure from shifting ice could crush wooden hulls. Escape routes opened briefly, then closed again without warning. Even steam engines, a technological advantage of the expedition, proved useless against the vast frozen landscape. Inside the ships, conditions steadily worsened. Food supplies declined. Illness spread. Morale collapsed. The Arctic winter offered no mercy. When Sir John Franklin died on June 11, 1847, leadership passed to Captain Francis Crozier. He now faced an impossible situation. 2 ships, over 100 men, no open water, and no realistic hope of rescue. The officers knew that staying aboard might prolong survival, but it also risked slow starvation if supplies ran out completely. The alternative was even more dangerous. Abandon the ships and attempt an overland journey toward the nearest known outposts of civilization. No one could be certain of the distance. No one fully understood the terrain. But staying meant waiting for death. So they chose movement over stagnation, hope over certainty, and risk over helplessness. The plan was brutally simple. The men would drag sledges across the ice. They would carry provisions, boats, and essential equipment. Once they reached open water or land, they would attempt to continue south. It sounded possible on paper. In reality, it was a nightmare. The Arctic is not flat. It is fractured. Broken ice fields create ridges, cracks, and jagged pressure walls. Moving heavy sledges across such terrain required enormous physical effort. Each step drained strength. Each mile demanded endurance beyond normal human limits. And all of this took place in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin within minutes. As the men left the ships, they entered a landscape that had no mercy for human weakness. The expedition was no longer a naval voyage. It had become a march for survival. The group carried with them fragments of their former life. Naval uniforms, instruments, journals, and tools. But the Arctic stripped away hierarchy. Rank meant little when hauling sledges across ice. Experience meant little when facing starvation. And discipline could not overcome exhaustion. Modern researchers believe the journey likely followed a slow and fragmented path. The group probably did not remain unified for long. Some men weakened faster than others. Illness spread unevenly. Leadership structures likely became less effective over time. In survival conditions, even well-trained crews begin to break into smaller groups. And once separated, survival chances decrease sharply. Evidence suggests that the survivors initially attempted to follow a route southward along King William Island. Their goal was likely the mainland of Canada. If they could reach established trading posts or known exploration routes, rescue might still be possible. But they faced a critical problem. They were moving through an unmapped and unforgiving environment. What appeared on maps as open pathways often turned out to be impassable ice or water channels. What seemed like land could be frozen sea. And what seemed like progress could easily become a trap. One of the most haunting discoveries supporting this journey came decades later. A large boat mounted on a sled. It was found far inland from the coast. Inside were personal belongings, naval supplies, and heavy equipment. The boat itself was too large for practical transport across such terrain. So why move it? Historians still debate this question. One explanation is that the crew hoped to reach open water and use the boat to sail further south. Another is that they were carrying essential supplies inside it. A third possibility is simpler and more tragic. They may have been acting on hope that no longer matched reality. As the march continued, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies ran low. Hunting opportunities were limited. The Arctic landscape offered almost no reliable sources of nutrition for inexperienced crews. Scurvy likely became widespread. Weakness would have spread silently, reducing endurance and decision-making ability. Cold exposure added further strain. Even small injuries could become life-threatening. Inuit oral histories collected later by explorers such as John Ray consistently describe groups of exhausted men traveling south. These accounts are not identical in every detail, but they share key themes. Men walking slowly. Men pulling sledges. Men showing signs of starvation. And eventually bodies left behind. These testimonies suggest a gradual collapse rather than a single catastrophic event. The expedition did not end in one place. It dissolved across distance and time. One of the most disturbing elements in the Inuit reports was the condition of the survivors. They were described as extremely weak. In some cases, they were unable to continue traveling. In others, they appeared confused or disoriented. Modern analysis suggests multiple contributing factors. Starvation, scurvy, hypothermia, and possibly lead exposure from long-term consumption of preserved food. No single cause explains everything. It was likely a combination of stressors acting together. As the survivors moved farther south, the group likely fragmented further. Some men may have attempted to push ahead for help. Others may have remained behind to care for the sick. Some may have chosen to rest in place. Hopping conditions would improve. But the Arctic offers no pause. No recovery. No safe waiting. Only survival or decline. At some point during this journey, most of the remaining men likely perished. The exact locations are still unknown. Ice and time have erased most physical traces. Only scattered artifacts and distant reports remain. Each discovery adds a small piece to the puzzle but never completes it. The Arctic is still holding the final chapter. One of the most important insights from modern historical reconstruction is that the expedition likely faced a tipping point. Once food supplies fell below a certain threshold, survival probability would have collapsed rapidly. At that stage, even strong individuals would weaken quickly. Movement would slow. Decision-making would deteriorate. And group survival would become nearly impossible. The march, once organized, likely turned into a struggle for individual survival. Despite the tragedy, the expedition's physical remnants continued to surface over time. Buttons, utensils, tools, and personal items have been discovered across the region. Each artifact confirms one fact. The men did not disappear in a single location. They spread out. They attempted to survive over a wide area. Their final journey covered far more ground than early explorers initially believed. By the end of this phase of the story, the Franklin expedition had transformed from a naval mission into something far more tragic. A prolonged collapse in one of the harshest environments on Earth. A collapse that unfolded step by step, month by month, and mile by mile. Yet even after reconstructing this death march, one question still haunted historians. What became of the ships themselves? Did they remain trapped in ice? Did they sink? Or had they drifted away, carrying secrets still locked inside their hulls? For more than a century and a half, that question would remain unanswered. Until modern exploration finally returned to the Arctic with new technology. And the final discoveries began to surface from beneath the ice, the ships found after 170 years. For more than a century and a half, the fate of the Franklin expedition remained incomplete. Historians had the graves. They had the cairn message. They had Inuit testimonies and scattered artifacts. They had reconstructed a death march across the Arctic ice. But two crucial pieces were still missing. HMS Erebus. HMS Terror. The ships themselves had never been found. And without them, the final truth of the expedition remained partially hidden. Then, in the 21st century, the Arctic began to give up its secrets. Slowly, carefully, and with astonishing clarity. Modern Arctic exploration changed dramatically with technology that Franklin's generation could never have imagined. Sonar mapping allowed researchers to scan the seafloor beneath thick ice. Remote-operated vehicles could dive into freezing waters. Satellite navigation made precise positioning possible. And indigenous knowledge long overlooked in early searches was finally treated as essential evidence rather than anecdote. This combination of science and traditional knowledge would finally unlock the last stage of the mystery. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic discovery at sea, but from careful interpretation of Inuit oral history combined with systematic underwater surveys. For decades, Inuit communities had preserved stories about a large ship that sank in the region of King William Island. Unlike earlier fragmented accounts, these later testimonies consistently pointed to a specific area of sea. That consistency mattered. It suggested memory rather than myth. And researchers began to take it seriously. In 2014, a Canadian government-led expedition focused its search in the waters of the Queen Maud Gulf. The team was led by Parks Canada archaeologists and supported by modern naval technology. Their objective was simple: locate one of Franklin's ships using sonar imaging. But the Arctic is never simple. Ice conditions were unpredictable. Visibility underwater was extremely limited. And the search area was vast. Still, they persisted. Then it happened. A sonar scan detected a large wooden structure resting on the seabed. The shape was unmistakable. A ship. Intact. Resting upright in relatively shallow water. The discovery was announced carefully, with scientific caution. But internally, researchers understood what they were seeing. It was one of Franklin's ships. Later confirmation identified it as HMS Erebus. The world's attention immediately turned to the Arctic once again. The wreck of Erebus was astonishingly well preserved. Cold water and low oxygen conditions had slowed decay. Much of the ship remained intact. Wooden structures, fittings, and interior sections were still visible. Even personal artifacts were found inside. Buttons, tools, and naval equipment lay exactly where they had fallen more than 160 years earlier. It was as if time had paused beneath the ice. The discovery transformed historical understanding of the expedition. For the first time, researchers could physically examine the final state of one of the lost ships. Evidence confirmed that Erebus had not simply been crushed immediately by ice. Instead, it appeared to have been deliberately abandoned and later sank in controlled conditions. This supported Inuit accounts that suggested the ship had been reoccupied at a later stage. It also suggested that the crew may have returned to the vessel after initially leaving it. The story was more complex than previously believed. Further investigations revealed additional clues about the ship's final years. Items inside the wreck suggested that some areas had been reorganized. Objects had been moved. Certain spaces appeared adapted for continued survival. This implied that at least some crew members may have attempted to use the ship as a shelter even after abandonment. It was no longer just a vessel. It may have become a final refuge. But Erebus was only part of the story. The second ship remained missing. HMS Terror still had not been found. For years after the Erebus discovery, the search continued. The Arctic remained silent again. Until another breakthrough emerged. In 2016, Inuit hunters and researchers working together identified another possible site in the far north of King William Island. Sonar surveys were conducted in the area. The water was shallow. The ice conditions were challenging. But something unusual appeared beneath the surface. A second ship. Intact. Preserved. Waiting. The vessel was identified as HMS Terror. Unlike Erebus, Terror appeared even more remarkably preserved. The hull remained largely intact. Masts and structural elements were visible. Even windows and interior sections were surprisingly well preserved. It had settled gently into the seabed, almost as if it had been carefully placed there. Not destroyed. Not shattered. But lowered into silence. The discovery of both ships finally completed the physical map of the Franklin expedition. For the first time since 1845, researchers could see the full arc of the journey. Departure from England. Winter at Beechey Island. Entrapment in ice near King William Island. Death of Franklin. Abandonment of ships. And final collapse on the ice. The ships confirmed what written records had suggested. But they also revealed new mysteries. One of the most intriguing findings came from the condition of terror. Evidence suggested that the ship may have been re-entered after abandonment. Some objects appeared undisturbed in ways that implied continued use. This raised new questions. Did survivors return to the ship? Was it used as a temporary shelter during the final phase of the expedition? Or did a smaller group of men attempt to maintain it as long as possible? The answers remain debated. What is clear is that both ships challenge earlier assumptions. The Franklin expedition was not a simple case of ships crushed immediately by ice. Instead, it appears to have been a prolonged struggle in which the ships remained central to survival longer than once believed. They were not just casualties of the Arctic. They were part of the survival story itself. As archaeological work continues, researchers carefully document every artifact recovered from the wrecks. Each object provides insight into daily life aboard the expedition. Each item adds detail to the human experience behind the tragedy. Forks, boots, tools, and personal belongings are not just historical objects. They are traces of individuals who lived, worked, and ultimately struggled for survival in extreme conditions. Yet even with both ships discovered, one final question remains. Why did the expedition fail so completely? The answer is not simple. It is not a single cause. It is a combination of factors. Extreme ice conditions, long-term entrapment, disease, starvation, possible nutritional deficiencies, and the overwhelming isolation of the Arctic environment. Franklin's expedition was not defeated by one event. It was defeated by time. Time trapped in ice. Time without rescue. Time that slowly erased strength, structure, and hope. Today, the Franklin expedition stands as one of history's most important lessons in exploration. It represents both human ambition and human vulnerability. It shows how advanced technology of one era can still be powerless against nature. And it reminds us that even the most organized expeditions can be undone by environments we only partially understand. The Arctic still holds its silence, but it no longer holds all its secrets. Because now, beneath the cold waters of King William Island, the final witnesses have been found. The ships that carried 129 men into history have been recovered. And their story, once lost, can finally be told with clarity. Final epilogue continued in Part 6 if you want. The Franklin expedition is no longer a mystery of absence. It is a documented journey of endurance, collapse, and discovery. But even now, researchers continue to ask, what exactly happened during the final months on the ice? And could any further evidence still lie undiscovered beneath the Arctic? The story in many ways is not fully over. It is simply better understood than ever before, the final days reconstructed. By the time both ships had been found, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, the Franklin expedition was no longer a mystery of disappearance. It had become a reconstruction problem. Historians now had fragments. A written note from the cairn. Graves on Beechy Island. Inuit testimonies. Artifact trails across King William Island. And finally, two remarkably preserved shipwrecks resting beneath Arctic waters. But even with all this evidence, one question still dominated every investigation. What exactly happened in the final days? Not in theory. Not in overview. But moment by moment, as the last survivors of the expedition disappeared into the Arctic landscape. By April 1848, when the final recorded message was written, the situation had already reached collapse. The surviving officers under Francis Crozier understood that the ships could no longer sustain life indefinitely. Food supplies were diminishing. Scurvy was likely widespread. The ice showed no sign of breaking. And the death of Sir John Franklin had removed the symbolic and command center of the expedition. What remained was not a functioning voyage. It was a survival crisis. Modern forensic reconstruction suggests that the abandonment of the ships was not a sudden decision made in one meeting. It was likely the result of gradual recognition. Day after day, the ice failed to release the vessels. Week after week, supplies were consumed. Month after month, hope narrowed. Eventually, the officers reached a conclusion that must have felt unbearable. Staying meant certain death. Leaving meant possible death. There were no good choices left. Only degrees of suffering. When the 105 remaining men left the ships, they entered what historians now call the terminal phase of the expedition. This phase was not defined by exploration. It was defined by survival breakdown. Group cohesion likely weakened almost immediately. In extreme Arctic conditions, human organization deteriorates faster than expected. Fatigue reduces cooperation. Cold reduces judgment. Hunger reduces patience. And fear reduces trust. Even disciplined naval crews are not immune to these effects. The march southward was initially planned with structure. Sledges were organized. Boats were transported. Supplies were distributed. But this structure likely degraded rapidly. Heavy loads became impossible to carry over rough ice ridges. Progress slowed. Rest periods increased. And every delay consumed more energy than the group could replace. At some point during the journey, the expedition likely split. This is supported by Inuit accounts describing men in smaller groups rather than one unified column. Once separation began, survival chances diverged sharply. Larger groups struggled with resource distribution. Smaller groups struggled with exposure and isolation. Either path was dangerous. Evidence suggests the men attempted to follow the western coastline of King William Island, hoping it would lead toward known regions of the Canadian mainland. But the geography was deceptive. What appeared to be land routes were often frozen sea ice. What appeared stable could suddenly break. And what seemed like progress could easily lead further into isolation. The boats recovered during later searches remain one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in this phase. One large ship's boat mounted on a sled was found far inland. It contained personal items, navigation tools, and heavy supplies. Its location suggests a desperate attempt to reach open water or usable terrain. But its abandonment also suggests failure before that goal could be achieved. The men had carried too much weight for too long, across terrain that punished every step. Eventually they stopped. Not because they arrived, but because they could not continue. As weeks passed, the survival conditions worsened dramatically. Scurvy likely became a major factor. This disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, leads to weakness, joint pain, and eventual organ failure. In Arctic conditions where fresh food is scarce, scurvy can spread quickly through a trapped population. Combined with starvation and exposure, it would have been devastating. At the same time, some researchers believe long-term lead exposure may have affected cognitive function. The expedition relied heavily on canned food. 19th-century preservation methods sometimes involved lead soldering. If contamination occurred, it could have caused fatigue, confusion, and behavioral changes. While this theory remains debated, it adds another layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. Inuit oral histories collected by explorers such as John Ray describe a pattern that aligns with physical deterioration. Men becoming weaker over time. Individuals falling behind. And bodies being encountered along the route. These accounts do not describe a single disaster event. They describe a slow fatting. A decline stretched across distance. One of the most haunting aspects of the final journey is how long it likely lasted. This was not a short escape attempt. It was a prolonged migration under impossible conditions. Even strong individuals in peak health would struggle to survive extended Arctic travel without resupply. The Franklin survivors were already weakened before they left the ships. That made every mile exponentially harder. As time progressed, survival logic likely replaced expedition discipline. Navigation gave way to instinct. Planning gave way to necessity. And group decisions may have become increasingly fragmented. Some men may have pressed ahead in hope of reaching help. Others may have stayed with the sick. Others may have chosen to rest where they collapsed, unable to continue. Archaeological findings support this fragmented pattern. Artifacts are scattered across wide areas rather than concentrated in a single site. This suggests movement by multiple small groups rather than one organized march. Each group left its own trace. Each trace tells part of the story. But none tell the full story alone. Eventually, most survivors likely reached a point where movement was no longer possible. At that stage, the Arctic becomes final. There is no recovery phase. No warming trend. No rescue opportunity. Only the environment continuing its natural cycle while human endurance collapses. The exact locations of the final deaths remain unknown. Ice movement over decades, followed by modern environmental changes, has erased many physical traces. What remains is inference, artifact distribution, oral history, and environmental reconstruction. Together, they form a pattern of gradual disappearance rather than sudden loss. Despite the tragedy, the expedition's legacy is not limited to failure. The search for Franklin contributed significantly to Arctic mapping. It expanded European understanding of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. It provided early ethnographic insight into Inuit knowledge systems. and it demonstrated the limits of 19th-century naval technology in extreme polar environments. The discovery of the ships in the 21st century closed one chapter of the mystery. But it also opened another. Because now historians must ask deeper questions. How did leadership decisions evolve during crisis? How did environmental pressure shape human behavior? And how did survival instincts override naval structure? The Franklin expedition is no longer simply a story of disappearance. It is a case study in human endurance under extreme conditions. A controlled historical record of collapse. And a reminder that exploration is not only about discovery, but also about risk, limitation, and survival. Today, the Arctic is still changing. Ice patterns shift with climate. New archaeological methods emerge. And researchers continue to analyze every recovered artifact for additional clues. It is possible that more details will surface in the future. But the central narrative is now clear. A confident expedition entered the Arctic. It became trapped. It attempted survival. And it slowly dissolved across an unforgiving landscape. The ships remain preserved beneath the water. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror now serve not as missing vessels but as underwater archives. They hold the final physical evidence of a journey that changed exploration history forever. And somewhere beyond them, across the frozen land and shifting ice of King William Island, lie the final unanswered traces of the men who left them behind. Not lost, not forgotten, but slowly returned to history. One discovery at a time.